studying 1 Thessalonians. Last year, our first year in these spatial type classes, we studied the book of Acts. What was the book of Acts about? 3 or 4 words. What? It was a history. It was a history of the New Testament church. Paul was the major individual in the latter part of it. It told about all of his journeys, where he went, things that he did, and in doing that, we learned where he wrote all of his books. We learned where he was, we learned why he wrote them, and we learned various things about him. So what did we learn about 1st and 2nd Thessalonians? They were the first 2 New Testament books. And so as we look here at the first 2 New Testament books then, that's the reason we'll be studying them first of all. We might put up a chart to show it in this way. That back here in 33 A.D., Christ died on the cross and he established his church. The church then began to go forth, and you study from Acts 1 down to Acts 18 verse 5, and that takes you down to A.D. 52. Now, during all those 19 years, there were no New Testament books written. Now, there may have been a book such as James. Some people think James was written somewhere in there. But as far as Paul's epistles, he didn't write any epistles for the first 19 years. Now, between there, 52 A.D. and 68 A.D., he wrote all of his other epistles. So he started writing at this time, and he began to write in that way. Now, there, I think, is a pretty good reason for this, and that is that when he started out on his journeys, he would start out, he would establish this church and this church and this church. Then he would go back around and he would visit this church and this church and this church. And there really wasn't a big need for him to be writing an epistle to that church at that time. But now, as he goes on, after 19 years, he has preached here, and he's preached all over. And so now there's several churches out there. Now, in this 19-year period, there have been a lot of problems that have arisen in the church. There have been false teachers that have raised their head, and they've started teaching some false doctrine. So they would go into the churches that Paul had established and teach this false doctrine. So they might go into the churches of Galatia. Paul is over at Corinth. What would be a good way for Paul to fight that false doctrine over in Galatia? Write him a letter. So he started writing letters. And of course, the more this went on, the more need there would be for letters. And so the latter part of his life, then he spent a great deal of it in writing these letters. But here in Acts 18 verse 5, as you're studying there, the year 1850, year AD 52, he writes both 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, probably within 2 or 3 months apart that he wrote them in there. Now then tonight, we want to see why we know that. We want to get in the introductory material here, and we want to see what do we know about that? How do we know such things as that happen? Now it's very, introductions to a class are kind of unique. If you don't give an introduction, you're going to miss a great deal, a whole lot as you're studying. If you give too much of an introduction, it puts everybody to sleep. And so in an introduction, it should be just right. It's kind of like introducing a boy to a girl. If there's a pretty girl comes in and we got a young man here, he would like to meet her, wouldn't it be nice for somebody to introduce him to her? And he goes up and says, John, this is Sally. That's too short. So a guy said, John, this is Sally. Sally goes to the University of Washington over here. She's a biology major. She lives over in Seattle, but she came over and she visits over here every once in a while, and so forth. And she has an interest in religion. And her name is, her dad's name is John. Now, her granddad's name is also John, so that means that her dad was actually a junior. Now, when Dad, by the way, Dad has a son which is her brother, and he named him John, so you're getting down, it's really confusing in this family. Now, what is this guy thinking as I'm introducing him this time? Shut your mouth, right? In other words, now you've told me too much, see? And so it's telling just enough so that you know what to expect. That's the way it is with this book. So tonight, that's what we're going to shoot for, is perfection, and we're going to try to give just enough to see how this book came to pass. Now, if you find out how this book came to pass, why Paul wrote this book, then you have mastered most of the book. We'll be able to go just zoom right through the book of 1 Thessalonians, and it's going to be easily understood. But if somebody comes in next week and they don't get an introduction, and they don't know why Paul wrote the book, the purpose and so forth behind it, they can go home and they can study and they can study and they can study, and they're not going to understand the book of 1 Thessalonians. And so an introduction is very, very important. Many of you have been through the book of Acts. We're going to be looking at some things that you've already been through, so you can sleep for the next 20 minutes or so, and we'll catch the other people up, but we want to see now why he wrote that book. First of all, we have a map. And on this map here, we have up here Asia that is up here in this area. Now, all of this area that is up in here is known as Asia. As you move on down here, you come on down to Israel, and then you get on down in this area down in here, and you're down in Egypt. Of course, what sea is this out here? The Mediterranean Sea. Now, as you move down here to this city, we always start with that one. What is that city? That's going to be Jerusalem, and then we go up here, and what is going to be that city? Antioch. Why is Antioch an important city when you are studying maps? Why is it that you always ought to look Jerusalem, Antioch, if you're going to study a Bible map, a New Testament map? What makes Antioch important? That's the launch point for Paul. That's where Paul started out on his missionary journeys. He went up there, and that became then the very center of where he would leave. He'd leave, go on his journey, he'd come back to Antioch. Then he'd leave and go on his journey, and then he would come back to Antioch. The last time he came down to Jerusalem, but on the first two there, well, he comes back down to this. Now, as we look at these cities here then, my clicker is not working tonight for some reason very well, so you give me trouble in here. Here we have Jerusalem, and up here we have Antioch. Now, as you move on over into other areas in here, why, you see up there is Troas. Now, this is going to be a map that just kind of shows mileage. Don't try to remember this mileage. All it does is just give you a perspective. In other words, it's a lot of times we say, wonder how far it is from here to here. So it just gives you a perspective is all it is. It's about 300 miles from Jerusalem up to Antioch. When you take off from Antioch and go to Troas, it's about 600 miles. And then as you go from Troas, you go on up to Philippi, and there then you find some more mileage in there. It's supposed to be coming down, about another 250 miles that is in there. From Philippi over to Thessalonica, that's where Thessalonica is going to be. There you have about 100 miles then at that time. Map says really 75, so it kind of depends on which map you use, the roads and so forth. Most commentators will tell you 100 miles from there. Then, as you move on from Thessalonica, and you go on down to Corinth. Now, I'm kind of emphasizing Corinth because Corinth is going to be an important city when you study Thessalonica, see, when you're studying that. And we'll see why in just a moment. But as we look at this, we see then the mileage that's there is about 200 miles that is down there. If you're going to come on back down there, it gives you an idea of about 800 miles that you go back. Now, up there we got Turkey. Today you hear of Turkey, and the country that in the New Testament was called Asia, today it's called Turkey. And you've heard of that in the news in this last week, haven't you? In other words, as the president's trying to get his coalition together, Turkey says, we will join with you. It is a Muslim country there, but they said, we will join with you, and so forth. And you can put your planes in our land and so forth. So there was quite a breakthrough in doing that. So up there we have that called Turkey then. It's about 1,100 miles up to Corinth, if you take off and go around to Corinth. So now then, let's kind of start out here again. And up there, the red dot is Thessalonica. Down there's Antioch. You follow the line up there. It'll take you up into Thessalonica. Now, back historical facts, and this is where it can get boring. And so, don't go to sleep. We're going to make it real quick. Thessalonica was a large seaport of Macedonia. So it's located right on the coast. It was situated in the form of an amphitheater on a slope of a hill. So try to picture now a slope coming down, a hill coming down into the Gulf, and it just kind of fans out like an amphitheater. Now, it was a coastal town in the Gulf of Salonika, which is not important. Now, it sat at the base of the Olympic Mountains, which is important, which was known as the seat or headquarters of the mythical gods of Greece. So now, you're going to have an unusual thing about Thessalonica. And that is, just geographically, it sat on a coastal shore. What makes that important? What makes a town important when you say, oh, it's a coastal town? Seattle, San Francisco, L.A., Portland? Traffic, that's right. And commerce and ships. And it was just as important then as it is today. So it was a very important city that was back there. Then we find, in ancient times, it was called Therma because of hot springs that were around it. Now, that was the name of it. And what would hot springs do to it? As you're trying to get acquainted and kind of trying to think, what would it be like to go to Thessalonica? Or if you went to Thessalonica, you're on a coast. It's going to be on a hill. It's kind of going to be just in an amphitheater, half of a circle. There's going to be a big mountain range back there. People are going to say the gods live in the mountains. And there's hot springs. What does that tell you? What would hot springs do? What does that bring in? What? All right, it's going to bring visitors in. Going to bring a lot of commerce in. People are going to be coming in to take the baths in the hot springs. And there were a few places over there that they have these hot springs. It's the same way in America. You find a city that has hot springs and people go there. Hot Springs, Arkansas is what they call the city down there. They just flood down there and have for years and years and years. So they have these hot springs up there. So they call the city Therma then. Now, the king of Macedonia rebuilt Therma, and he called it Thessalonica after the name of his wife, who was the half-sister of Alexander the Great. So, tells you how it's got its name. How in the world did Thessalonica get that name? Well, that's what the guy's wife's name was there that he named it after. Then, also, in Roman times, it became a city of great importance and was the capital of the second province. Only Philippi would be recognized as greater. Now, Philippi was the capital of what they call the first province, the major province. It was the capital of King County. And then Thessalonica, the capital of Snohomish County. The bigger was up there with Philippi, but Thessalonica was the second major city in all of Macedonia. It was there. Now, this church was established under great persecution, as we'll learn. It was mainly Gentile converts who suffered persecution from the Jews, as well as their fellow idolaters. So they had a lot of persecution. It was destroyed at the time of the Crusaders in the 10th or the 11th century. It was the last church in the New Testament times to finally go out of existence. Now, we all know that as you study history, what happened to the church in the 1st and 2nd and 3rd centuries and then finally full-blown in the 6th century? It apostatized, didn't it? It went astray, And of course, this church did the same thing. But the only point that I'm making is, as you look at Christianity and compare it to the Muslim religion and other religions, it was the last vestige of what was called Christianity to fall when the Crusaders went in under Muhammad and destroyed it there. So it has quite a history behind it, Thessalonica does. Now, to this day, it ranks second to Turkey in Turkey, only to Constantinople. Constantinople would be up just above Troas, and of course, everybody hears about Constantinople. It's the major city, but today, Thessalonica has a population of well over 100,000, and the name now has been changed to Saloniki, which again goes back to the sea that it is in up there. So you can see the name changes that it went through. This is just some interesting things about it. All that I'm giving you this for is just to make it a living city, a real city, instead of just a name, you see, that we're after. It's in Turkey. Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Now then, let's go back to the map, and let's look here and start building a map and Paul's journeys. As he goes up into this area, he comes up to Troas, goes on over up into Philippi, Thessalonica, on down to Berea, on down to Athens, and over at Corinth. Now, there is where he wrote his 2 books. So we're going to get back to that, and we'll see why. We're just talking about it. We're just introducing it. Remember a little while ago I said Corinth will be an important city because that's where Paul was when he wrote these 2 books. And it's kind of interesting to see how he gets over there in doing that. That's a total of 1,105 miles that he traveled all the way around to get over there. And again, the mileage is just for our own sake in here. Paul and Silas took off on this journey, second journey. They go up to Lystra and they pick up Timothy. Then they go on up into Bithynia. And he wanted to turn north and go to Bithynia. You remember why he didn't? Holy Spirit said you can't. So he said, no problem, I'll go south. Because there wasn't any churches down there around Asia and so forth. So he headed south. But he didn't make it. Why? Holy Spirit said no. Can't go down there either. Well, if he's just come from that direction, he can't go north and can't go south. Which way does he go? He's going to head on over. So he's going to head on over really to the coastland that's over there. And so he comes over to Troas. Now, when he gets to Troas, he has quite a problem. As you try to read his mind, he has a problem. His problem is, where do I go from here? I've come from that one direction. The Holy Spirit said I can't go north. The Holy Spirit said I can't go south. And I'm over here at this here. Why didn't he just jump on a boat and go? I mean, you and I would have been that smart, wouldn't we? But he didn't. He didn't go. And it took a major event, a miracle, to get him to go. You have any idea why he hesitated? What? Well, why did he hesitate? Why didn't he just go? It's so simple to me, that's what he should have done. Isn't it simple to you? But yet he hesitated. It's a different country. He's leaving Asia and going to Europe. He's leaving the East and going to the West. Is there any difference in the East and the West? Any difference in continents? Yeah. Okay. The gospel has never been preached over on this continent. Christians have never gone over there, as far as we know. Now, there's been some that's gone on over, clear on over into Italy, into Rome, but over in here, they haven't gone. And so Paul is there. Shall I leave my homeland and go on over? And so he's meditating. He doesn't really know what to do. And that's where the Macedonian call comes in then. Now, you read all about this in what chapter of the book of Acts? It's the history book. Chapter 16. All right, you go down there and you read about it, and it tells you about it down here in verses 6 through 9, and it said, and in a vision appeared to Paul in the night, and there was a man of Macedonia standing, beseeching him, and saying, Come over into Macedonia and help us. So that night, he had a vision. And in that vision, he saw all the way across that sea. And this guy's over there yelling, Come over here and help us. And he woke up, and he said, That was God telling me I should go on over. So that's what then gave him the initiative and so forth to head on over. So he, here at Troas, picked up Dr. Luke. Now then he has with him Silas and Timothy and Luke. All right, he goes from there over to a little island, up to a little city called Neapolis, which means a new town, and then from there on the coastline over to Philippi, which is the major city. And he stopped in Philippi, and he started looking around, and his custom was he always went into a certain place to preach. Where was it? Into a synagogue. But here he couldn't find a synagogue. Now, according to Jewish law, now synagogues are not found in the Bible, in the Old Testament. There's no law about a synagogue. This is something that came up between the Testaments. And so the Jews had a law that you had to have 11 male Jews in order to have a synagogue. And so evidently there weren't 11 male Jews in the town of Philippi. Philippi was a Roman city, Gentile city. So he goes out there and he hears about a woman that is worshiping God. She would obviously be worshiping Jehovah God under Jewish law. And she's down by the riverside with some people. And so he goes down there. And what was her name? Lydia. He goes down and he preaches to them and baptizes Lydia. He goes up. She says, Come home, stay with me. So they went up, stayed in her house. And then they began to preach in Philippi. Well, we'll not get into the details of this, but there was an interesting conversion there. What conversion is related in the Bible? The Philippian jailer. That's right. So he was converted. They arrested Paul here in Philippi because of some activities he was involved in. They trumped up a false charge, and they charged him with preaching treason against Rome. They said he preaches that there's another king, there's another ruler other than Caesar, and so they arrested him on that charge. They brought him in, they beat him, and so he had some successes here at Philippi, and then he had some bad things to happen. So finally, he left Philippi. Now, when he left Philippi, then he goes on down through a couple other places. Luke stays there at Philippi, and he goes down to Thessalonica. Now, he walks into Thessalonica, and that's where we pick up our story in chapter 17 of the book of Acts. So, I want you to turn there, and we're going to study verse by verse, a few verses here in the 17th chapter of the book of Acts. Now, in the 17th chapter, we start out, and it says, Now when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, that's two little towns right outside of Philippi there, and I might point this out to you also. The people in Acts class already got this, but the way we know that he picked up Luke here is because of the we pronouns. If you want to look very quickly, let us look right down here to chapter 16, verse 6. Now, by the way, who wrote the book of Acts? Luke. So Luke is writing, and Luke said, and they went through. That doesn't include Luke, does it? See, Luke's saying that Paul and Timothy here and Silas, they came down there. Verse 7, and when they were come over into Mysia, and then verse 8, and they came down to Troas. Luke is not with them when he come to Troas. Now in verse 10, and when he had seen the vision, straightway we sought to go forth into Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. So what happened at Troas? Luke says they came to Troas, and we left Troas. See? So they picked up Luke there. Now then, he's down there in Philippi, all of them, and in verse 40 of the 16th chapter, and they went out of the prison, entered into the house of Lydia, and when they had seen the brethren, they comforted them and departed. Keep reading verse 17, verse 1. Now when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia. So do you see? Luke stayed there at Philippi? No question about it. Okay, so now then, we have Paul, Silas, and Timothy. They go down to Thessalonica. Okay, when they get down to Thessalonica, it said, and where was a synagogue of the Jews. Now, there wasn't any synagogue in Philippi, so it said, now there was one in Thessalonica. So it's a synagogue. And Paul, as his custom was, went in unto them, and for 3 Sabbath days reasoned with them from the Scriptures, opening and alleging that it behooved the Christ to suffer and to rise again from the dead, and that this Jesus, whom, said he, I proclaim unto you, is the Christ. Now, Paul went into the Jewish synagogue. And as he went into the Jewish synagogue, he went in and he began to preach, and he preached 2 things. He first of all took the Jewish Bible, and he preached that the prophets in the Jewish Bible, the prophets, proclaimed that the Christ would die and raise again. That was a shock to the Jews. But he would turn over Isaiah 53 and other places, and he'd read it to them. And they would study it. And there it is in their Bible. And they would say, huh, I didn't know that. I've learned something. I've learned that when our Christ comes, he's going to die. And he'll be raised. But that didn't make them mad. They didn't make them mad. It just, they said, we've learned something. Now, when they were convinced that the Christ, the Messiah, when he came, he would die and be raised, then Paul would go to the second part of his sermon. And his sermon is, this Jesus whom we preach died and was raised from the dead. Therefore, this Jesus of Nazareth is the Christ. Now, when he preached that, that is when eruption came. See, that's when the eruption came, when he tried to prove that Jesus was the Christ and had died and raised from the dead. That's what caused the controversy. Now, nowhere in the Old Testament does it say Jesus would die and raise from the dead. Now, I want to be real careful with this because I don't want anybody to go home and have the wrong idea. What was it I said? Nowhere in the Bible does it say Jesus would die. It does say the Christ would die. You see the difference? It does say the Christ would die and raise from the dead. Now then, Jesus came, and he did die, and he raised from the dead. And what's our proof for that? Because we don't have any scripture that says Jesus. What's the proof? The witnesses. The apostles were all witnesses, and here you have all this testimony, all these witnesses, that this happened to Jesus. He died and raised from the dead, and therefore, what do we know about him? He's the Christ. See? All right, so that's what he preached. Now, that's when they would go berserk. The Jews would go berserk at that point. So what happened right in here? In verse 4, and some of them were persuaded, he did convert some, and consorted with Paul and Silas, and of the devout Greeks a great multitude, and of the chief women not a few. Now, there's 3 categories he mentions here. Jews. He converted Jews. How many? Few. He converted Greeks. How many? A great multitude. And he not only converted women, but what's unusual about these women? These were leading women of the community. These were the women of power and influence. These were the leaders. These were the wives of the of the congressmen and the mayors, and these were the ones that had power. And he even converted many of them that was there. All right, now, he's got them converted. And then it says in verse 5, but the Jews, now they're really jealous, being moved with jealousy, took unto them certain vile fellows of the rabble. Vile means empty, mean, worthless. Of the rabble is what we would say Skid Row, First Avenue, the wino section, the low class. So they go get certain guys, they pay them off, and they, gathering a crowd, set the city in an uproar, and assaulting the house of Jason, they brought them forth to the people. And when they found them not, they dragged forth Jason and certain brethren before the rulers of the city, crying, these that have turned the city upside down come hither also, whom Jason hath received, and all these act contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, one Jesus. So these Jews say, we got to get this guy. So they run down to Skid Row. They get these guys down there of absolutely no worth. They pay them to come up and testify against Paul. And they're going to come up and they're going to testify. We've heard Paul preach. There's somebody in opposition to Caesar. What do you call that? Treason. See? We've heard that he's preaching here that there's another king here other than Caesar, and it's contrary to the decrees of Caesar. He says you shouldn't obey Caesar. Did Paul ever say you shouldn't obey Caesar? What did he say in Romans 13? Obey Caesar. See? And so they said, but we've heard him say that, and he said there's another king by the name of Jesus. Well, this is treason. See? And so they then, the city, they get all upset. They run down to the house of Jason because that's where Paul was staying. Went down to get him, couldn't find him. So they arrested Jason. Took Jason down, and then Jason didn't tell them where they were. And so then they took what's called a bond today from Jason, as you read it down there in verse 9. And when they had taken security from Jason, the rest they let them go. So what they did was they said, okay, here's what you have to do. You've got to sign your house over, or you've got to give us $10,000, or I don't know the amount, but it would be a large amount. You have to give us this, and if these guys show up again, you forfeit it. So you're going to lose it. So Paul now has this predicament that if he stays there and continues preaching, Jason, these brethren, they're going to lose the wealth that they have. So he said, well, okay, what I'll do then is go on down to Berea. So in verse 10, and the brethren immediately sent away Paul and Silas by night unto Berea, who when they were come thither went into the synagogue of the Jews. So now they go down to the little town right just next to it there, Berea, and they go into the synagogue and they start preaching. Now that's where that famous verse is. The people at Berea were more noble than those of Thessalonica. They received the word then with all readiness of mind. But the Jews at Thessalonica heard that they were down at Berea, so they came down to Berea and stirred up a big fuss down at Berea. And so Paul had to leave Berea. Now, the interesting thing is, in all of this, as we'll see, Timothy stayed at Thessalonica. When Paul left, Timothy stayed up there. When he got ready to leave Berea, Silas stayed up at Berea. But he's going to have to leave there. Now, the next chart, I'm going to cut this map down to just the red. So we'll cut the map down to where it's just a small portion in here. So we go through this thing again here. Here's where he did all of these. Here's where then he left Luke up there, went through these two little towns, came down to Thessalonica. Now, as he came down to Thessalonica, what do you suppose this green thing represents? It's a wonderful work of art. I did it myself. So I have to tell you what it represents. The Olympic Mountains. So it represents the Olympic Mountains right outside Thessalonica. By the way, that's where we got our name over here for our mountains outside of Seattle, was from that range that's over there, the Olympic Mountains. And so the Greek mythology that had all of these gods according to their mythology, up in the Olympic Mountains, that was the headquarters or the seat of the gods. That's where the gods lived. Who was the major god, the big god? Zeus. He's the big one. And he lives up there. Now, what would Thessalonica be famous for? What would people in Thessalonica, what kind of religion would they have? Let me ask you this. I bet you John Morrow can get this. If you go to Rome, what's the major religion in Rome, John? He doesn't know. Let's try somebody else. Okay. If you go to where the headquarters is, go to where the Pope lives, what do you normally expect? That's where it's going to be filled with Catholics. When you have a headquarters in a certain town, that's where the citizenry are going to be congregating around that. So now then, here we have idolatry, the worshiping of the gods. And of course, the Greeks and the Romans, they worshipped all the gods. They didn't just pick out a god. They worshipped all of them. And so up there's the gods. So down here in Thessalonica, what kind of population would you have? What kind of people would you have? Idolaters. You'd have idolaters. What kind of idolaters would you have? Good ones or bad ones? That's kind of a loaded question because there ain't no good ones. But you would have good idolaters. What do I mean about good idolaters? Devoted idolaters. You would have idolaters that were just devoted to their religion, ready to die for their religion, ready to kill for their religion. They were idolaters all the way through. See, that's what you would have there. It's kind of interesting as you study all the books of the Bible and you study the cities and you find that the churches in those cities are just like the people of the cities, really. For instance, up at Philippi, that was an unusual town. That was populated with Roman soldiers, retired Roman soldiers is what it was populated by. And a Roman soldier, they were idolaters, they were trained to kill, they were professional, they spent their whole life in the service, just killing people. But one thing they did, they had integrity. When they said they were going to do something, they did it or they died. They were trained that way. That when the generals took them off, the Roman army, they were devoted to him, and whatever he said, that's what they did. They would die. They were honored. If a man showed any kind of vacillation in the Roman army, of lack of disobedience, the soldiers killed him. It was not tolerated at all. So these veterans that have been through it, one thing you could say about them is that they were what we would call men. They were ready to fight for what they believed for. Their word was their bond. So when you went in and you converted 100 people in Philippi, what kind of a church would you expect to have? Solid, great, good church. And you know the Philippian church is the only church of the New Testament that didn't give Paul some troubles when he was there. They were solid. They were his crown and his joy. Well, as you move over into Thessalonica, now you come across a different caliber of people. Over here, you come across idolaters. Well, the world was full of idolaters. Everywhere that you went, there was idolaters. But they weren't the same caliber of idolaters that there was at Thessalonica. What kind of idolaters were there at Thessalonica? Devoted. See, devoted. Okay, that's going to play a big role in the First Thessalonian letter. If we don't understand that, we're not going to understand First Thessalonians. We'll say, wonder why he's making a big deal out of this. Wonder why he's talking about this. So, the Olympic Mountains and the Greek gods, their headquarters, and the people down there that had all of this feeling and so forth, that's important for us to get in there. So Paul then had to leave, and he went down to Berea. He left Timothy there. Then he goes down, and he had to leave again, and he left Silas there. Now, when he left Silas there, he went down to the shore, and he came around to Athens. Now, we might say this about it. As you come up here to verse 2, 17:2, and Paul, as his custom was, went into the synagogue for 3 Sabbath days. Now, that's how long he was in the synagogues. But he was in Thessalonica longer than 3 Sabbath days. We're going to find statements he makes to them in there. He wrote to the Philippians one time, and he said, you sent to me, and he says, at least twice, while I was down at Thessalonica, you supported me. Kind of hard to support a man twice in 3 weeks, and you see when you have to walk to do it. He's going to write back to them, and he's going to say, your reputation has gone throughout the world. That's pretty hard to do in 3 weeks. And so he was up there for longer than that 3-week period of time. We don't know how long he was up there. But he was there, and then he got run out, and now then he's going to go around to Athens. Now as he goes around to Athens, that brings you down into chapter 17, verse 16, and you get down there. He comes in there. I'm going to skip over this right in here. I'm going to go down to this next thing right in here. And I want to show you some pictures right here, and then we're going to close in about 2 minutes. As he goes into Athens, here's a hill that he would see. Mars Hill, or the Areopagus. Remember he went up there and preached? How much success did he have there in Athens? Very little. It was there. This is the Nike Temple that is up there. Got any idea where our Nike tennis shoes, the name came from? Okay, so the word means victory in Greek. There's a close-up of the temple that was there. The Parthenon that was made to the goddess Athena that was there. So we're looking here at a city full of idols that Paul would have been looking at again. But look at the great structure. I'm just showing this to you to see. Paul didn't go into a bunch of dummies. He went in where there were cities, great, gorgeous, beautiful, well-constructed, powerful cities. Just awesome cities that was there. There's an entryway able you to get up there to Mars Hill. So a lot of these things just very powerful. There's what's left of the temple of Zeus. They really built him a great temple that was there. It goes down to Corinth. There's a Corinthian column that is there that's in the city. It's about the only thing that was left there. But you can see the greatness of the city that he was in at this time. So now, Paul, he goes down to Athens, and he leaves Timothy and Silas back up there. Now, let's go through this. Where did he leave Luke? Philippi. Where did he leave Timothy? Thessalonica. Where did he leave Silas? At Berea. And then he goes on down to what city? Athens. And that's where we pick up our story next week.